They slid a yellow envelope under my gate and gave me 30 minutes to gather whatever I cared about and leave like I had someplace else to go. Like this land was somebody else's idea and I was the problem child, not the man who'd been up before dawn for 20 years fixing a sagging fence and coaxing life out of clay soil. My name's Jake Mercer, and I still remember the smell of that paper, toner and wet ink and a kind of official calm that was supposed to make me feel small. And for a second when the sheriff's SUV idled at the gravel road and the deputy stared at me like he was reading a script, I felt that small, too, until I didn't. I grew up in places where you learn the difference between owning a piece of ground and living on it, where deeds and plat maps are as real as the holler in your throat when you call the cattle. Cedar Hollow was my answer to city noise. 30 acres, a crooked barn that squeals in the wind, an apple tree that only needs one good storm to get stubborn. I fixed things myself. I paid the taxes, I mowed more than a man should admit to, and I waved at folks at the mailbox. But I never imagined I'd be arguing over a stretch of gravel that's been used by everybody since my granddad drove a tractor across it. That's where the trouble began, not with a gun or a dramatic confrontation, but with a letterhead. A new subdivision rolled in up the road, tidy houses, plastic mailboxes, a stone sign that said Hearthside Commons, like it owned the word home, and someone there decided my gravel lane didn't belong to me. Their board sent violation notices. Then a friendly neighbor or so I thought started asking whether the lane was common property. I answered, politely, because that's what you do. You don't inflame folks just because they wear a sash and think a clipboard is a sword. But politeness doesn't stop people who want control. Complaints trickled into the county, to the association, to insurance companies. Someone called the water district claiming I'd poisoned a culvert. Another caller said my fence blocked a view. And then one night the chain on my gate was cut, and my gate dangled like a question mark. The sheriff took a report, shook his head. Neighbor disputes, he said, and left a card. The letters kept coming. The tone changed. The calm on their letterhead became a pressure, a slow machine. I did the only thing that felt sane. I started to keep paper. Every stamped envelope, every email, every deputy's badge number, every photo with a timestamp, I put in a binder. It sounds ridiculous, like prepping for a battle you hope never happens, but there's dignity in being organized when chaos comes calling. I learned to like the county clerk's counter, the way the clerk, a woman named Ruth with ink on her fingers, would make a sound when she flipped through old plat books, like she was opening a secret. She pointed me to a faded map, to a notation that had been overlooked, an orphan parcel, a sliver of land the surveyors never really sorted out when developers scribbled lines and dotted names. It was small, a paper thing, but it had a county seal and a number, and it had been treated like an afterthought for decades. When they announced the surplus land auction, I went. I sat in the folding chairs in a fluorescent room, while people in suits and hard hats looked like they belonged to other lifetimes. And I bid in the sort of quiet way a man bids on something he's been thinking about for years, something he doesn't want to fight over, but has to have. I won. The deed was a little square of green paper that smelled like the courthouse and old coffee. And when Ruth signed it, and the notary stamped my name, I felt an odd, simple joy, not triumph so much as relief. Because for the first time there was a document that matched what I felt under my boots. Owning that parcel didn't make me a hero, and it didn't erase the mess. But it shifted the grammar of the whole thing. Paperwork became leverage. Leverage became conversation. Conversation became a public one. I wasn't the guy screaming into the wind. I was the guy who showed up with proof, and proof is a different kind of force. I drafted a notice, had a lawyer look it over, not to make enemies, but to make sure the record was clear, and then I did something that felt almost silly. I walked into the next homeowners meeting with my binder under my arm. They were already there, the same faces from the notices and the social posts. The president of the board with perfect nails and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, Deborah Lang. That's what the sign said, and a room full of people who'd been fed a version of the story that painted me as the odd man out. I set the binder down in front of Deborah like it was a claim and a promise, and I said, slow and steady, "Look at this." The room went quiet like you shut an oven and everything inside settles, and Deborah's smile cooled. She tried a few things first, a thin apology that was really a counter, a joke about county lines and how confusing they were. Then, when the papers began to be read aloud, when the deed and the auction record and the timestamps lined up like witnesses, She shifted to a different mode. Flinty, clipped, small barbs passed as questions. "Where did you get that?" she asked, like a woman discovering an inconvenient truth in her morning tea. I said, "The county. The auction. Right there." And I pushed the deed forward so everyone could see the seal. Someone in the back snapped a photo. The local reporter, because of course the local reporter had heard something, started taking notes. The power of a document is the way it stops people from pretending. You think that's when it ends? That moral clarity solves everything? It doesn't. People double down when they're embarrassed, and organizations with a reputation to protect can be vicious in quiet ways. Smear posts, anonymous complaints to inspectors, a campaign of calls to vendors saying the property was involved in a dispute, and suddenly a man who'd been selling hay to the community for years found vendors backing away. I got a late-night phone call from a trucker who said his company had been pressured. He sounded ashamed to be the messenger. Somebody in a suit told me legal headaches could cost me more than I'd won at auction. The strain crept in like rain through a ceiling. But there's an economy to truth and patience. The public meeting had shifted the narrative out of private memos and into daylight, and daylight is unforgiving for fabricated stories. Neighbors who'd been told one thing heard the documents and thought, wait, hold on, and that hesitation is what unravels a lot of neat, public facades. The county got involved on a procedural level, not because I wanted a headline, but because a public body has to answer to records, and when they came and checked and verified, things changed fast in a way that felt almost too tidy until you remember it had been built on years of stubborn work. The climax, and it is a picturesque thing if you like your drama with documentary grit, happened the week after the meeting when the board tried to vote on a punitive fine. I stood up and I read a short letter, not a threat, not a promise to ruin anyone, but a plain statement. County records indicate ownership, the attempted fines are unenforceable, and the community should consider mediation rather than escalation. Deborah's face when I finished was something I won't forget. Anger folded into the realization she'd miscalculated, and the room held its breath like a crowd watching a train cross. There was a moment where you could have heard a pin drop, then the murmurs, then the slow, inevitable reshuffling. Afterward, people talked, real neighbors, not the keyboard ones, and some apologized in small, awkward ways, and some looked away, and a couple of older men who'd been on the fence for years came up and shook my hand, as if to say thanks without the drama. The board found itself under scrutiny. There were calls to reform bylaws, to get counsel that wasn't just a friendly local lawyer with a nice logo, and within a few months a new slate of people took seats on the board who actually lived nearby and didn't see rules as weapons. It wasn't perfect, governance never is, but it felt like the house had been opened and sunlight had hit the corner where dust collects, and you could see it for what it was. What I learned, and what I keep thinking about when the wind lays the grass down in the evening and I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, is how much power there is in humility plus stubbornness. You don't have to be loud to be right, and you don't have to be vengeful to be firm, but you do have to pay attention, to show up at the county clerk's office, to take notes, to keep receipts. There's a strange moral poetry to paperwork. It's not romantic, but it's honest. And there's a dignity in refusing to let a story about you be written by people who don't know your name. So here's where it ends and where it doesn't. Cedar Hollow still has its quirks. Deborah still lives up the road, and I wave at her sometimes. She never did apologize outright. And maybe that's her right, but the lane is accessible, the charter's been revised, and the kids who ride by on bikes in the summer don't worry about notices. Mine is not a revenge story, and it's not a clean victory with confetti, but it's a reminder that community is not a slogan. It's the messy work of neighbors learning how to be neighbors. If this story strikes a chord, if you've ever had a notice that felt like an accusation, if you've ever watched an institution use rules to push a person aside, tell me what you would have done. Tell me where you think the line is between community standards and bullying. And if you think paperwork is romance, tell me why you're right. Drop a comment, leave a thought. And if this made you sit up a little straighter about records and deeds, share it with someone who owns a lane or a fence or a stubborn piece of ground, because sometimes the best thing we can do is make daylight for someone else.